The topic of this webinar is on performance policies and how you use performance policies within OCI. So what we're going to be covering is just the types of data that OCI collects. We're going to get into some of the out-of-the-box performance policies. We're going to talk about how to create a new performance policy. We're going to talk a little bit about the violation dashboard and how performance policies get populated to that. And then at the end, we'll run through a couple of example performance policies and show you how to create those. And what you should see now is the documentation, the Help Center for OCI, the 7.3 Doc Center. If you go and if you just want to, copy down that URL or take a screenshot of that, this is a good location to save just for, documentation for OCI and data warehouse related information. So, but if you go here to the how-to guides under there, and how-to guides, and then there should be, let's see, I'm looking for the, looks like the third bullet down, creating performance policies. But anyway, for the performance policy documentation, you can read about it here. So this is a good link to save. I just wanted to show you where that was and how to get to it. So I'm going to close that now. The other thing, when you think about OCI, there are two types of information that we collect. Okay, so if I go over to admin and data sources, when you set, this is a lab environment, so don't pay any attention to the errors that you're seeing here. But when you set up a new data source, you can pull in two different types of information. You're going to collect inventory information and performance information. So inventory is about like, how many arrays do I have? How many storage pools, flex vols on the arrays? What are the names of those storage pools, that kind of thing. We also get, in addition to inventory information, we also get performance information, obviously. So what is, my LUNs or my volumes, what are the IOPS on those things? What's the latency on that? What's the throughput? How many megabits per second are they generating? So we pull in that kind of information as well, like every, whatever the polling cycle is. And we store the inventory information in a MySQL relational database engine under the covers, and we store the performance information in Elasticsearch. Okay, but both of those sets of information are stored locally, on the operating system, of the OCI server. So now that we know what kind of information, okay, then we want to start monitoring that. So what I'm going to do on this screen is you've got these 4 tabs across the top. We see dashboards, queries, and manage. Okay, so if I go to manage, I get to performance policies right here. It's the bottom option. Okay, so in this environment, this is actually a lab environment. So in your environment, you may see more just out of the box. When you install OCI fresh, before you make any changes, you're going to get a default set of performance policies. And I'm looking at kind of a revised default set of policies here. But you can actually take these policies. If I pick one of these, if I don't want these, I can certainly delete them. Okay, so you could come over and I just hit that, hover over that until that line is selected, and you've got the modify and the delete options there to remove those policies if you don't want them. I can also come in and modify them. If I click on that little edit, that little pencil icon there, okay, it brings up the editor view for the specific policy. Okay, but this is just the default set of policies. So let's say that, I didn't like any of them and I want to start fresh. I'm going to create a brand new policy. So let's talk about some of the options when I create a new policy. So the first thing I look at is I look at the policy name. Okay, so this is just, I'm just going to call this right now, as it's a demo, I'm just call it demo. Okay, then you have all of the different objects that you can select in your policy. So these are going to be the types of objects that OCI brings in and that OCI knows about. so these objects are actually coming in from the data source acquisition. So when you set up your data sources and you're talking to storage arrays, maybe switches, if you have a fiber channel infrastructure, you might be talking to different hosts, so you're talking to virtual machines, these kinds of things. These are objects. So I go in and I can choose the different object, whether it's a data store, a hypervisor, the flex balls, storage pools. So I choose the object that I'm interested in here. Now, annotation, we'll come back and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but annotation at this point, this is just a way that you can use to filter your performance policy. Now, we'll come back and we'll hit this in a little more detail in a few minutes. The other thing, and let's drop down right now just to the actual metrics. Okay, so if the internal volume, I have metrics that are specific to the type of object that I choose. Okay, so since I've chosen internal volume, I'm going to see possible metrics like IOPS. What are the total IOPS? I'm going to see another interesting one is latency. Okay, the snapshot information, the deduplication, the compression, those kinds of metrics are available to you as well. QoS time. So if I change this, let's look at something like a virtual machine, and I look at the metrics for a VM, and you see they're totally different. Okay, so I've got things like swap rate. Okay, where the virtual machine is swapping, back and forth from the hypervisor memory in and out. So the point of this conversation right now is that the metrics that are available are context sensitive to whatever object type you choose. So, and same thing, if I chose application, it's very limited. I'm just looking at the anomaly scores if I had the anomaly detection engine installed, okay? So other options that you have when setting up your policy is this thing called apply after a window of time, okay? So this is the first occurrence, maybe after 15 minutes, after an hour. What this does for you is, let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm monitoring latency on a flex ball or on an internal volume. So in the OCI world, internal volumes are equivalent to a flex ball. They're the same thing. Okay, so I may use the terms interchangeably. So flex ball equals internal volume. So, but let's say the latency spikes up. It's normally humming along around 4 or 5 milliseconds, and all of a sudden the latency spikes up, and it goes to like 20 or 30 milliseconds. Okay, but it only lasts for a couple minutes, maybe even a few seconds. Okay, I may not want to know about that because it's not significant. But if that latency spikes up to that 30 millisecond level, and if it stays there for 15 or 20 minutes, okay, now it starts to become significant. Okay, so that's where I would use this apply after a window, where I would set it to maybe 30 minutes. Okay, if I was looking at say internal volume, and then I had a 30 millisecond, and I specified the total latency, say, was greater than 20. Okay, so this tells me this would monitor for internal volumes or flex vols with a latency greater than 20 milliseconds, but that latency has to be sustained over a 30-minute window. Okay, that's what that apply after a window does for you. Now, the other thing, we also have this severity of warning and critical. So what that says is when this event gets triggered, okay, how do I want the message to be sent? Do I want it sent as a warning message or as a critical message? Okay, and then that'll be like a little flag in your email notification, so you can set a higher priority to that incoming message. The other thing that you can do is you can add additional metrics to this. Okay, like right now on this internal volume, I'm only looking at latency. But let's say that I wanted to add an additional one. Let's say that I wanted to also look at IOPS, okay? So I'm looking at the total IOPS maybe is greater than, so this is greater than or less than, so it's greater than, let's say 200, okay? So now what this policy is looking for now is the latency is greater than 20 or the IOPS is greater than 200. Notice I kind of punctuated the or, okay, and that's because of this little create alert if any, okay. So what this does, it says if the latency or if the IOPS, that's what this is doing now. So I actually don't want that. I want all in this, because what this is going to do now, it says that my flex vols have to have both of these conditions to be true. So it's a Boolean true that both of these conditions have to be met. So the latency has to be greater than 20 milliseconds and the IOPS have to be larger than 200 IOPS per second, okay? And if that happens and it's sustained over a 30-minute period of time, then the event would be triggered with a warning message, okay? And maybe I want to change that to a critical, okay? So now it would be triggered with a critical message. Now, one other thing while we're on this screen is you have this little checkbox down at the bottom. Stop processing further policies if alert is generated. So what this does for you is, let's say that I have multiple policies that apply to my flex vols, okay? What would happen if I click this and let's say that this policy, the threshold gets tripped, okay? If that happens, an alert has already gone out and then no further performance policies that apply to flex vols will be processed, even with different criteria. If they apply to this object type, no further policies will get processed until this one gets resolved. Okay, so that's what you do with that. Now let me show you. We were talking about the severity, the critical and warning. In order for these messages to get sent out, you have to make sure that you come over to your admin and your notifications. This is where you set up your email server. So in here you type in your Exchange or your SMTP mail server, and the signature that you want to use, and the recipients where it's going to be sent, and then you come in over to events, and this is where you say what type for performance violation events. Do you want to send critical events or warning or above and do not send? Okay, so this configuration in notifications actually applies to the performance policies. If you set up your performance policies, and I've had customers do this, is they set up a whole bunch of performance policies and then they don't get notified when a threshold gets breached, and they open a support ticket, or they call us, or we're talking to them, and they want to know why. Well, it's because they never configured their SMTP mail server. So that is a critical step. Now, let's go back to the policies, and I want to show you something else here. One thing that they did, and I forget what version it was that this was introduced, but in email recipients, everything used to be sent out. All the policies just used to go to one address. And now we have the ability to actually come in, and let's say for my flex vols, I could come in and I could add a distribution list in the recipients, because let's say that I'm a large organization and I have one team that manages my storage environment. I have another team of engineers that manages my virtualization estate, and then I have other people that manage my host and my let's say I have a large fiber channel. I have a bunch of FC switches and multiple fabrics, And so I don't necessarily want the VM team to be receiving alerts that apply to storage, and the storage guys don't want to get events that are really relevant to my fiber channel, engineers. So you set up you populate this recipient field with, the appropriate distribution list. And that way, it keeps everybody's inbox a whole lot cleaner. The other thing that I wanted to mention when I was over on the notification screen is that you also, and I didn't mention this, if you want the performance violations, not just to go to email, most people use email, but there may be if you have a trap host, like an SNMP trap host, or I don't know too many folks that use syslog servers anymore, but you could actually specify that those events, get sent to, say, a trap server, and then maybe you generate a help desk ticket based upon the the SNMP trap that gets sent. And we do, we have the MIB available. If you do use SNMP, we could show you how to where that MIB is so that you could set that up. Okay. The other thing on this screen, and let me switch over. I want to switch to a different, I'm going to switch to a different OCI server so I can show you this. Okay. On the dashboard screen, we have this thing. Okay, so this is the main landing page. I'm looking at the asset dashboard now. But if I come to the violation dashboard, and we have a violation table. Now, in the violation table, when a performance policy gets tripped, okay, it's going to register a violation. Now, right now, I'm looking at just a 1-hour view, but if I change this, I'm going to change this for the sake of this demo to a 3-hour view, okay? And you can also filter this. So I'm looking at performance violations, but I can also filter these out. So let's say that I only want to look at things, maybe, let's see. Okay, so if I just type latency in there, okay, it's gonna filter this with latency types of events. And I see this one, let's see. Here's a VM with let's see, latency is greater than 25 milliseconds. And the current value, the latency was actually 59, almost 60 milliseconds. So here it tells you, if I hover over that icon, that's the virtual machine. And if I were to click on this VM, that would take me to the landing page for that virtual machine. Now, from this screen, also, if I come over to this hyperlink, this is actually the policy. And I can look at this to see all the policies, the performance policies that have been tripped. And then I could actually click on this to look at the definition of that policy. So it gives me the policy name. It applies to virtual machines on first occurrence. They're not filtering with annotations. And it's being generated with a critical event. And latency is greater than 25 milliseconds, okay? So that's how you could just look at this violation table to get a snapshot, kind of a quick and dirty view, of the performance issues that are happening in your environment over the last 3 hours, or let's say you come in every day and you want to look at the entire previous day. Okay, you could do that, and then you could use this filter option up here. I mean, you could plug in a specific VM. If you're tracking a specific VM, you could use that to filter that, to look at those VMs. Okay. So let's move on to a few, let's see, let's move on to a few examples. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we'll create let's say, I could do, BB, I'm going to do BB credit. And this is specified on a port. And I could say I want to check, I check, these are fiber channel ports, either connected to host, switches, storage arrays, tape devices, or I could just leave it blank. And I could say first occurrence, I want to receive first occurrence, and I would do the BB credit 0, and I might change that to the transmit credit maybe is greater than, I might do greater than 1 million. What this does is it says, because in a fiber channel network, ports actually have to have buffer to buffer credits before they can transmit data. If they run out of buffer to buffer credits, then you're going to have some, it's like a flow control issue in a fiber channel network. So this would be a way to monitor that, okay? Another possible thing that you might do is let's change this, and I'm just going to call the name internal volume. Let's switch to internal volumes, and I could say maybe the latency, total latency, and we kind of showed this earlier, but total latency is greater than 20 milliseconds. And I could add another threshold, and where the IOPS is greater than, say, 100 or 200, and that is just like we were showing before, where both of those conditions, because if I have high latency but the FlexVol is not doing any traffic, or there's no throughput coming from that, then I may not really care about it. Okay, you could do the same thing not just on internal volumes, but you could do the same thing on volumes, which volumes in the OCI world is a LUN. A LUN is a volume. So you can do the same kinds of things there, where you're looking at high latency. Let's move on to something a little more interesting, where you could do, and I want to show you how the annotations work with this. So let me close this for a minute. And what I did is I created a new annotation. Now I know this little webinar is not about annotations, so I went ahead and created an annotation earlier. And let me just show you the one that I created. So I made an annotation called virtualization priority. Okay, and if I look at this annotation, this is to use to be assigned to virtual objects to identify basically their priority, their organizational priority, whether it's a mission critical, business essential, or a support function, for that VM. And so what you would do is you would apply that annotation policy. So let me show you that. I'm going to create a new query, and I'm going to search for host. And I'm going to come over to, I'm looking for the, I'm looking for this one right here where it says is hypervisor. So in OCI, I could have hosts that are just regular, host servers, or it could be a hypervisor. So I'm only interested in finding the hypervisors, okay? And now or I'm interested, that's what I'm showing here, whether it's a hypervisor or not. So with the X's here indicate that these hosts are not hypervisors, but if I scroll down, let's see, I had some in here. There I have these hosts at the top that are hypervisors. So I'm going to add a filter at the top, and I'm going to call this is hypervisor, and then I'm going to say yes. Okay. So now I have 156 objects that, see, all of these are hypervisors. So let's say, just for the sake of conversation, that I'm going to take these top 3 and I'm going to apply I'm going to add an annotation to those. So I choose my virtualization priority annotation, the one that I created earlier and the one that we just looked at. So I choose that and I say these hypervisors are running mission critical VMs. So I'm going to choose that mission critical. I'm going to save that. Okay. Now, when I go back to my performance policy, and I'm going to add a policy, mission critical hypervisors. Okay. And apply to objects of type. Okay, I'm going to apply this to hypervisors because that's the name. This is the object type that I'm applying it to. Now, I'm going to filter. I don't want this to apply to all hypervisors in my environment. I only want it to apply to a small subset. Okay, so I'm going to filter with that annotation and say virtualization priority, and then I have the options. Okay, what value do I want it to assign to? So I want to watch the mission critical ones. Okay, and the thing that I'm interested in here now is I'm going to issue a critical warning if the total latency is greater than 10 milliseconds. Okay. So that's one example of how you could use annotations with the performance policy to really, so that applies. And then you could have other performance policies that apply to, you know, the other values in the virtualization priority. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, cancel that. And just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, you might also want to do this with, say, VMs. You might want to do it with the EXS. Let's see. Let's look at virtual machines. You know, you could look at swap rates. And so what this would be, this is kind of interesting. I've played around with this a little bit lately. You could look at a swap rate, maybe greater than 1024. So if you have let's say you have a hypervisor that you suspect may be having some memory constraint issues, and it's overloaded, it's overburdened because it's running too many virtual machines, and what it's doing is you think it's swapping memory, you know, from the hypervisor back and forth. And so you could look and set up a performance policy to say what's the swap rate. And you know, I just threw in 1024 there, but you could check with your virtual team to say, hey, I'd like to kind of measure this or monitor this. You know, what's a good swap rate value in our environment to look at? And you know, hopefully you could get some guidance there. You could also look at additional things like CPU utilization, memory utilization, CPU utilization. You know, those are good measurements to look at. The thing to keep in mind is you don't want to set up a whole bunch of performance policies with really low thresholds, because then you're getting alerted, you know, with just too many events, and it's going to be like event overload, and you're going to get so much information that you actually don't respond to any of it. Okay, so you want to be kind of judicious and careful about what events you set up to make sure that the events you set up are actionable type of events. Okay, that is pretty much all I had.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Aaron.